Clara Whitmore did not cry. That was the thing everyone remembered afterward. Not Nathaniel's words. Not Isabella Monroe's dress. Not the sound of 200 people holding their breath in a room full of candlelight. They remembered that Clara Whitmore did not cry. She stood in the center of that ballroom while her husband dismantled 8 years of her life in front of Virginia's finest families, and she did not make a single sound. She just looked at him. The way a woman looks at something she finally completely understands. If this story speaks to something in you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Part 1. The Night He Destroyed Her Name. Virginia Summer, 1818. Whitmore Estate had never looked more beautiful than it did the night Nathaniel used it to break his wife in public. Clara had overseen every detail of that evening herself. The candles, 200 of them, arranged along the main hall and the ballroom in the particular way that made the light look warm rather than harsh. The flowers brought up from the garden she had planted and tended herself over 8 years. The menu planned with cook 3 weeks in advance adjusted twice when she learned that Judge Morley's wife had a sensitivity to certain spices, and that the Aldrich family was bringing their eldest daughter who was 17, and for whom this would be her first formal evening among Virginia's established families. Clara had thought of all of it. She always thought of all of it. That was the thing about being the wife of Nathaniel Whitmore. There was always more to think of, and he always trusted that it would be thought of, and he had never once asked by whom. She stood near the east window when the guests began arriving, greeting them in the way she had learned over 8 years to greet people warmly, but not effusively, with the particular skill of making each person feel that their presence was specifically valued, rather than generally expected. She knew the names of Judge Morley's grandchildren. She knew that Mrs. Pemberton had been unwell in June and asked after her health with genuine interest. She knew that young Thomas Aldrich had recently completed his legal studies, and she congratulated him directly and watched him stand up straighter from the recognition. Nathaniel moved through the same room, shaking hands and accepting compliments on the estate's appearance, with the easy confidence of a man who had always inhabited the foreground. Clara watched him. She had been watching him for 8 years with the careful attention of a woman who loved someone and was beginning slowly and with great reluctance to understand that what she was seeing might not be what she had believed she was looking at. He was handsome. He had always been handsome. Tall, assured, with the kind of face that photographs well in daylight and candlelight both. He moved through a room as though the room had been arranged for him, which on this particular evening it quite literally had been. By her. She looked at him, and she felt something she could not yet name. Not quite love, not quite its absence. Something in between the particular ache of a feeling that is leaving, but has not yet fully gone. She told herself tonight is a celebration. 8 years. A good marriage, if not a perfect one. A life that was worth honoring. She told herself that. She had been telling herself that for some time. 1. Nathaniel found her by the window an hour into the evening. He was in good spirits, she could tell by the way he held his glass loosely, with the comfort of a man who had been receiving exactly the kind of social attention he found most nourishing. People had been complimenting the estate all evening. He had been accepting those compliments. Clara. He touched her elbow briefly. You've done well tonight. Thank you. The Morley family seems pleased. I believe they are. She looked at him. Are you? He looked across the room rather than at her. Of course. A pause. I need to speak with you later, after the guests have had a chance to settle. Something moved through her at that, a small careful warning, the way the air changes before weather. About later, he said. He squeezed her elbow once and moved away. She watched him go, and she noticed for the first time, or perhaps for the first time, that she allowed herself to fully notice the direction he moved toward. Isabella Monroe stood near the far end of the room in a gown the color of deep water. She was 26, dark-haired, with the particular beauty of a woman who understood exactly how her beauty functioned and deployed it accordingly. She was the daughter of a Charleston family of good, but somewhat reduced standing, a guest of the Aldrich family, and she had been at 3 of the same social occasions as Nathaniel in the past 4 months. Clara had noticed her before. She had told herself she was being uncharitable. She watched Nathaniel cross the room. She watched Isabella Monroe's face when he arrived at her side, and she stopped telling herself she was being uncharitable. The evening moved through its expected rhythms. Supper was served and was by every observable measure a success. The conversation was lively. The wine was good. Nathaniel was charming at the head of the table, and Clara was gracious at the other end, and they performed the particular choreography of a long marriage in public, the small smiles across the table, the shared management of conversation, the practiced ease of two people who know how to present themselves as a unit even when they are not entirely one. After supper, the guests moved back to the ballroom. Music started, and Nathaniel stepped up onto the low platform at the north end of the room that Clara had arranged as a speaking area, because she had expected tonight, of all nights, that he might want to say a few words. She had thought it would be about the estate, about their years together, about gratitude. She had arranged the platform for exactly that. She would spend a long time afterward thinking about that. He tapped his glass. The room quieted with the quick obedience of guests who like their host and are curious what he has to say. Clara stood 20 feet away. She looked at her husband on the platform she had built for him. She put a smile on her face, because that was what the moment seemed to call for. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Nathaniel said. His voice carried easily. He had always been good at rooms. 8 years is a significant occasion. And I have found myself in recent months thinking about what it means to mark significant occasions honestly. Something in the air changed. Clara felt it. She could not have said exactly what it was, a subtle shift in temperature, in quality of attention. The room was still smiling, but the smiling had become slightly uncertain. "I have come to believe," Nathaniel continued, "that the greatest dishonesty a man can commit is to allow a situation to continue past the point where it serves the truth." He paused. "Tonight I find I must correct a mistake I made 8 years ago." The room went very still. Clara heard her own heart. She heard it clearly, which meant the room was quiet enough that everyone else might hear it too, and she was grateful suddenly and fiercely for the music having stopped. "Your marriage?" someone asked. It was old Judge Morley, who had known Nathaniel's father, and who asked the question with the directness of a man too old to manage social delicacy on short notice. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Not with cruelty, not with the dramatic relish of a villain in a stage production. That would have been in some ways easier. He looked at her with a kind of resignation, as though he had thought about this for a long time and had arrived sadly but firmly at a conclusion. "Yes," he said, "my marriage." And then he turned and extended his hand toward the far edge of the room, and Isabella Monroe stepped forward from where she had been standing in her deep blue gown and took it. "My heart," Nathaniel said to the room, to the 200 people Clara had invited and fed and welcomed into her home, "has always belonged elsewhere." 200 people made the sound that 200 people make when they witness something they did not expect and do not know how to process. It was not a single sound. It was many small sounds, the intake of breath, the soft collision of whispers, beginning the shift of bodies that happens when people are uncomfortable and uncertain whether to move or stay still. Clara stood in the middle of it. She did not move. She was aware of several things simultaneously, the way a person becomes aware of many things at once when the ordinary flow of time has been interrupted by something extraordinary. She was aware of Isabella Monroe's hand in her husband's. She was aware of the flowers she had chosen 3 weeks ago now decorating the room in which this was happening. She was aware of Mrs. Pemberton somewhere to her left saying something in a low voice to her companion. She was aware of Judge Morley's face, which had gone from surprise to angry in a way that was almost reassuring in its clarity. And she was aware above all, beneath all, through all of it, of the particular sensation of something she had been building for 8 years, cracking cleanly down the middle, the way ice cracks on a river in spring, with a sound that is both final and somehow a relief after the long cold waiting. She heard pieces of what the room was saying. "Poor woman. She must have failed him somehow. A man doesn't do this without cause. Perhaps she was never quite... She stopped hearing specific words after that. They blurred into a general sound. The sound of 200 people deciding the shape of something they had witnessed. Deciding whose fault it was deciding. As people always do, as they had always done, as they would always do, that a woman in this position must have earned it somehow. She had heard that sound before. She had never expected to be the woman it was about. Clara Whitmore looked down at her left hand. The ring had been her mother's. A simple gold band with a small diamond that her father had given her mother in a farmhouse in Maryland when they had nothing but the intention of building something together. Clara had worn it for 8 years. She had never once taken it off. She began to slide it off her finger. The room watched her. She could feel them watching 200 pairs of eyes tracking the small, quiet motion of her hand. She had given them spectacle tonight without intending to. She would not give them anything further. But before she could complete the motion, before she could place the ring down and lift her head and begin the long necessary work of deciding what came next, a voice came from the back of the room. Not loud, deliberate. The voice of a man who had measured his words before he spoke them. "Before this room makes up its mind," the voice said, "I'd like to offer it one thing to consider." Every head turned. Alexander Caldwell stood near the entrance to the ballroom. He was 41 years old, lean with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular bearing of a man who had been in enough serious rooms to have stopped being impressed by them. He was a lawyer, one of the finest in Richmond, which meant one of the finest in Virginia, and he had been invited tonight because he had been Nathaniel Whitmore's family's legal counsel for 11 years. He was looking at Nathaniel when he spoke. Then he looked at Clara. "A woman's worth," he said, clearly in a voice that carried to every corner of that room, "is not decided by the man who failed to recognize it." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. It was the silence of a room being asked to reconsider something it had just started to conclude. Nathaniel's face changed. "Caldwell," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man warning another man that a line is being approached. "This is a private matter. You made it a public one," Alexander said pleasantly. He had not moved from his position near the door. He did not need to. He had the room's attention without moving. "Before 200 witnesses in your wife's home at the celebration she arranged for your marriage. I'd say the private moment has passed." A sound moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of people whose instinct was to agree with what they had just heard, but who were uncertain whether it was safe to show that yet. "You overstep," Nathaniel said. "Possibly." Alexander looked at him steadily. "Though I notice Mrs. Whitmore has not asked me to stop." Every head turned to Clara. She had not moved. She was still standing in the center of the room with the ring half off her finger, and she looked at Alexander Caldwell across the distance of that ballroom, and she made a decision that she did not fully understand yet, but that felt in the most visceral way correct. She took the ring the rest of the way off. She held it in her palm. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed her hand around it, not throwing it down, not making theater of it, just holding it because it had been her mother's. And her mother had nothing to do with this, and she lifted her head. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected it to be steady. She was grateful that it was. She looked at Nathaniel. Not with anger, she did not have access to anger, yet it would come later in waves for months. She looked at him with the same expression she had been wearing when she watched him cross the room toward Isabella Munro. The expression of a woman who has finished telling herself something that was not true. "Excuse me," she said to the room, and she walked out. She went to the library. Not because it was a particularly meaningful choice, she simply needed a room that was not the ballroom, and the library was close, and it was the room in this house where she had always gone to think. She sat in the chair by the window, and she opened her hand and looked at the ring. 8 years. She thought about the first year when Whitmore Estate had been struggling with debts she had discovered only after the wedding debts Nathaniel had not disclosed. Not from malice, but from the particular carelessness of a man who had always trusted that things would be managed. She had managed them, quietly. Over 2 years, she had renegotiated 3 credit arrangements, sold 2 pieces of her own jewelry, and reorganized the household accounts with a precision that had stabilized the estate without Nathaniel ever fully understanding how close to the edge they had come. She thought about 1815 when Nathaniel had made a business arrangement with a man named Forsyth in Richmond that had gone badly wrong. She had spent 4 months quietly building relationships with Forsyth's creditors that allowed the situation to be resolved without public scandal, without legal proceeding, without Nathaniel's reputation being permanently damaged. He had thanked her. He had been genuinely grateful. For about 3 weeks. Then he had returned to the natural posture of a man whose world ran smoothly and who did not spend significant time asking why. She thought about the estate manager she had hired in 1816 over Nathaniel's initial skepticism, the man who had turned the South Fields from a liability into a productive asset within 18 months. She thought about the water arrangement she had negotiated with the Crawford family that had saved them a legal dispute. She thought about the workers whose wages she had ensured were paid on time, even in the lean months, because she understood in a way Nathaniel did not quite grasp that a household ran on the trust of the people inside it. She thought about 8 years of decisions that had kept this estate functioning, this family respectable, this man's public position unthreatened. And she thought about 200 people in that ballroom deciding that she must have failed. Something moved through her. It was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was not rage, though, that was coming. It was something more fundamental. A reckoning, the particular sensation of a woman who has been looking at her life through a certain light for a long time, suddenly seeing it in a completely different one. She had not failed Nathaniel Whitmore. She had spent 8 years succeeding on his behalf. The knock at the library door was quiet. "Come in," she said. Alexander Caldwell opened the door and stood in the frame. He did not come in uninvited. He simply stood there. "Mrs. Whitmore?" He looked at her with the steady, unperforming attention of a man who was not deciding what to feel, but was simply feeling it. "I wanted to make certain you were. I wanted to make certain you had someone to speak to if you wished to speak." "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question as though it deserved genuine consideration. "Because what happened in that room was wrong," he said. "And because you walked out of it with more dignity than anyone had any right to expect. And I thought someone should acknowledge that." Clara looked at him. She had known Alexander Caldwell for 4 years, in the particular way one knows the family's legal counsel present at significant moments, reliable in professional matters, known well enough to be comfortable with, but not so well as to constitute actual intimacy. He was intelligent. She had always known that. He was fair in a way that she had observed across several legal matters and had come to trust. She had not, until this moment, known that he was someone who would stand in a room full of Virginia's finest families and say what he had just said. "That was brave of you," she said. "It was accurate," he said. "Accuracy rarely requires much bravery if you're willing to accept the consequences." "Nathaniel will not be pleased." "No." A pause. "I expect I'll be relieving myself of the Whitmore family legal account effective tonight." She stared at him. "You'll lose the business." "Yes?" He said it simply as a fact. "Some things cost what they cost." Clara looked down at the ring in her hand. Then she looked back up at Alexander Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I don't know yet what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to go, or what any of this. I don't have a plan." "You don't need one tonight," he said. "I need something." "You have tonight," he said. "And in the morning, if you choose to, you have options. I can help you understand what they are if that would be useful." He paused. "Not because I am taking sides in a dispute between clients. I have made my position on that clear. But because you are a woman who has been treated unjustly in a very public way, and you deserve to understand exactly what the law gives you standing to do about it." Clara held his gaze. She thought, "I do not know this man well enough to trust him." She thought, "I have known Nathaniel for 10 years, and tonight I discovered I did not know him at all." She thought, trust is not about duration. Elizabeth Harrington. She had heard the story. Everyone in Virginia had heard it by now. The Harrington Assembly, the Red Folder, the wife who had documented everything. Elizabeth Harrington had spent 22 years trusting a man who did not see her. Clara had spent 8. She was 32 years old. She was not going to spend the next 22 the same way. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her, and Clara Whitmore, still holding her mother's ring in her closed fist, began to think clearly for the first time all evening. Back in the ballroom, Nathaniel Whitmore was discovering what happens to a room when the center of gravity has left it. It had not gone the way he had imagined. He was not certain, in the honest part of himself, that he rarely visited what he had imagined exactly. He had been rehearsing the moment for weeks, the clarity of finally saying what was true, the relief of no longer maintaining a pretense. He had told himself it was about honesty. He had told himself that Clara would understand eventually. He had told himself that a clean break was kinder than a long, slow ending. He had not thought carefully enough about what 200 people would see. Isabella was beside him now, her hand still in his, and the room was changed. The warmth of earlier in the evening had cooled into something more guarded. People were speaking to him because they were polite people, and this was his home, but the conversations were shorter than they had been. The compliments were thinner. Judge Morley had left entirely without speaking to him, which Nathaniel felt more than he had expected to. "Where did she go?" Isabella asked quietly. "The library, probably." He kept his voice low. "She always goes to the library." "Should you go to her?" "Not yet." He looked across the room. "She needs time." Isabella said nothing, but something in her expression, something Nathaniel caught only briefly before it was smoothed away, was not the expression he expected from a woman who had just been publicly claimed by the man she loved. It was the expression of a woman who was calculating. He told himself he was imagining it. He had been telling himself a great many things lately. The evening ended earlier than Clara had planned. People did not stay for the dancing. They left in ones and twos with the subdued urgency of guests who have witnessed something they need to process in private. Some of them said farewell to Nathaniel. Several more than he noticed, fewer than Clara would have asked after her. By 11 o'clock, Whitmore Estate was quiet. Nathaniel came to the library at past. Alexander Caldwell had left an hour earlier, after sitting with Clara for 40 minutes. They had talked practically specifically about legal options and immediate decisions, and he had given her 3 things before he left his card. His word that he would be available whenever she needed counsel, and the particular kind of steady, undemonstrative respect that costs a person nothing to perform and everything to actually mean. She had watched him go and thought, that is a man who does what he says. She had not thought that about anyone in a long time. When Nathaniel came in, Clara was still in the same chair. She heard the door. She did not turn. He came and stood in the center of the room. Her room, the room she had furnished where she had spent 8 years of evenings with her books and her accounts and her thinking, and he said, "Clara." She turned then. She looked at her husband. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the wrong question. She could see on some level that he understood it was the wrong question. She watched him hear it as it left his mouth, watched the slight wince of a man who has said a thing and immediately knows it was not the right thing. But it was the question he had, and he had asked it. "No," she said, simply, without drama. I know tonight was not—" He stopped, started again. "I handled that badly." "You did. I should have told you privately, first, before—" "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to say more, but had run perhaps for the first time up against the limit of what words could do. He had always been good with words. He had always been able to talk his way into smoother water. He had been doing it for years in business and society with her. She was looking at him with eyes that were simply clear. She was not giving him anything to work with. "What do you want?" he said finally. "Tell me what you want and I will do my best to— tonight." She looked at him steadily. "Tonight I want you to leave this room." He blinked. "Clara." I am not asking you to leave the house. I am asking you to leave this room." She held his gaze without effort. "I will have more to say tomorrow. And the day after. We have a great deal to work through, and I intend to approach it carefully and honestly." She paused. "But I am not doing any of that tonight, Nathaniel. Tonight is mine." He looked at her. He had expected tears. He had expected anger. He had expected the grief of a woman who had been blindsided. He had not expected this quiet, complete, entirely self-possessed woman sitting in the chair with her closed fist and her clear eyes and the particular stillness of someone who has in the past 2 hours made some fundamental internal shift and is not going back. "All right," he said. He moved toward the door. He stopped. "I didn't mean to humiliate you," he said. "That was not— Oh, I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because what you meant and what you did are two different things," she said, "and I am only responsible for dealing with what you did." He had nothing to say to that. He left. Clara sat in the library with the door closed and the house quiet, and the ring still in her fist, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. She thought about Alexander Caldwell's card on the desk beside her. She thought about what he had said. "You have tonight. In the morning, you have options." She thought about 8 years of work that had kept this estate standing. She thought about the sound of 200 people deciding she had failed. She opened her hand and looked at her mother's ring one more time. Then she set it carefully on the desk. Not a dramatic gesture. Not for anyone to see. Just a woman alone in a room she had made her own, setting down the weight of something that was finished, and beginning for the first time in a long time to think about what she was going to build next. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat in the library until the candles burned low, and then she sat in the dark and she thought. Not with the frantic spinning quality of a mind in crisis, she had passed through that in the first hour, and come out the other side into something quieter and more purposeful. She thought the way she had always thought when the estate's accounts needed reorganizing, or when a creditor needed managing systematically, honestly, without the interference of what she wished were true. What was true was this: she was 32 years old. She had come into this marriage with a small inheritance from her father, enough to be comfortable but not enough to be independent, which was the particular financial condition of women of her class in Virginia. In 1818, a condition so common it barely warranted naming. She had brought that inheritance into the marriage, along with her intelligence and her capacity for work, and her genuine earnest belief that Nathaniel Whitmore was a man worth building a life with. What she had built was considerable. What she had built was also legally not hers. That was the second thing she thought about. Not with self-pity. Self-pity was a luxury she had never found much use for, but with the cold clarity of a woman who understood that feeling wronged and being protected were two entirely different conditions, and she needed to quickly become an expert in the second. She picked up Alexander Caldwell's card from the desk. She turned it over in her fingers in the dark. In the morning you have options. She intended to understand exactly what those were. Nathaniel was not at breakfast. She had not expected him to be. The house had a particular quality to it that morning, a held-breath feeling, the way houses feel after something significant has happened inside them. Cook brought coffee without being asked, and set it down, and looked at Clara with an expression that contained entire paragraphs, and said nothing at all which Clara understood and appreciated. "Thank you, Mary," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Cook paused at the door. "Will Mr. Whitmore be requiring breakfast?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "You might ask him." Cook nodded and left, and Clara drank her coffee and looked at the morning through the dining room window and organized her thoughts with the methodical attention she had always given to things that mattered. She had 3 immediate questions. Where would she live? What were her legal standing and options? And what practically, specifically, not emotionally, did she intend to do with the next chapter of her life? The third question could wait. The first 2 could not. She sent a note to Alexander Caldwell's Richmond office before 9 o'clock. His response arrived before noon. He would call that afternoon if she was willing to receive him. If she preferred a neutral location, he could suggest an alternative, whatever was most comfortable for her. She wrote back, "Here is fine, 3 o'clock." She spent the hours between organizing papers, not as a distraction, because it needed doing, because Whitmore Estates' accounts for the previous quarter were in her writing desk and she had been the one managing them, and she intended to understand exactly what she was walking away from before she walked away from anything. What she found spending those morning hours with the ledgers was something she had half known and never quite looked at directly. The estate was profitable. It was profitable because of decisions she had made. The South Fields, the Crawford water arrangement, the renegotiation of the Forsyth business debacle of 1815, every inflection point in the past 8 years where the Whitmore financial picture had improved, traced back in her own handwriting to something she had done. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote down a number. It was the number she estimated represented the value of those decisions conservatively calculated across 8 years. It was a large number. She looked at it. Then she added a second number below it, the value of her father's inheritance brought into the marriage and absorbed into the estate's general accounts in the way such things were absorbed. She looked at both numbers. She was not a lawyer. She did not know what she was entitled to under Virginia law. But she was a woman who understood accounts, and the accounts told a clear story. She had not come to this marriage with nothing. She had not given nothing during it. She intended to leave with something. Alexander arrived at 3 o'clock exactly, which told her something about him. Not a man who came early to establish advantage or late to suggest his time was more valuable. 3 o'clock as agreed. Thomas showed him into the parlor, the smaller parlor, not the formal one, because Clara had made that choice deliberately. The formal parlor was where Nathaniel conducted business. The smaller one was where she had always had her own conversations. Alexander removed his hat and sat in the chair she indicated without making anything of the fact that she had indicated rather than offered. He looked at her directly the way he had the previous night. Not assessing, just present. "How are you this morning?" he asked. "Functional," she said. "I've been going through the accounts." Something moved through his expression. Respect, she thought, though he didn't perform it. "And I have questions about what I'm entitled to." She set the paper with her 2 numbers on the table between them. "These are conservative estimates. I want to understand if they're relevant to any legal proceeding, or if I'm simply feeling wrongly that they ought to be." He looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long moment, longer than it took to read it, which told her he was thinking rather than just reading. "Under Virginia law," he said carefully, "a wife's contributions to the management and improvement of a marital estate are complicated to quantify for the purposes of legal remedy." He paused. "That is the honest answer." "I expected the honest answer." "The less comfortable honest answer is that the law as currently written does not treat these contributions the way they deserve to be treated." He looked at her steadily. "What the law does give you is this: your personal property brought into the marriage is recoverable. Your father's inheritance, depending on how it was structured when it entered the marital accounts, may be partially recoverable." He paused. "And Nathaniel Whitmore, having conducted himself as he did last night in a room full of witnesses, including 2 sitting judges, has very little legal or social standing from which to dispute a generous settlement." Clara looked at him. "You're saying he owes me more than the law requires, but less than I deserve?" "Yes." No hesitation. "That is exactly what I'm saying." She appreciated that. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend that before you make any decisions about legal proceedings or settlement, you secure independent housing. Not because I expect Nathaniel to behave badly, though I cannot guarantee that, but because conducting a negotiation from inside the home of the person you are negotiating with puts you at a psychological disadvantage that has no legal remedy." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I don't have independent housing." "I know." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "My mother's house in Richmond has been empty since she passed 2 winters ago. I haven't been able to decide what to do with it. It is furnished. It is comfortable. It is not charity, he said. And he said that part with particular precision, as though he had anticipated her response to the word charity and had prepared against it. It is the practical solution to an immediate problem offered by someone who has a resource you need and no particular use for it at the moment. Clara looked at the folded paper. She did not take it immediately. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "And I want the real answer, not the gracious one." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man avoiding the question, the quiet of a man giving it its due. "Because I sat across from Nathaniel Whitmore in legal meetings for 11 years, he said, and I saw the estate's accounts, and I knew who was actually managing them, even when the credit went elsewhere. Because I watched you over those years handle every room you walked into with more intelligence and more grace than most men I know, and I watched you receive less acknowledgement for it than a reliable farmhand." He paused. "And because last night you walked out of that ballroom with your head up when any other response would have been entirely understandable, and I thought that woman deserved someone in her corner." Clara held his gaze. She thought about Elizabeth Harrington's story, the version that had spread through Virginia over the past year, the story of a woman who had done everything and been seen by no one until it was too late. She was not Elizabeth Harrington. She was still alive. She still had time. She took the paper. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Alexander," he said. Then catching himself, "If you prefer." "Alexander," she agreed. And she set the paper on top of her 2 numbers, and she looked at this man who had walked into her crisis without being asked, and had offered practical help without asking for gratitude, and she thought, "I do not know yet what this is, but it is something real, and real is what I need." So, she told Nathaniel that evening. He was in his study, the formal study all leather and dark wood, the room he used for business meetings, and that she had always found cold. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in and stood and did not sit, because sitting suggested a conversation, and this was not a conversation. This was a statement. "I am moving to Richmond," she said. "I have arranged accommodation. I would like to begin discussions about a formal separation through legal counsel within the week." Nathaniel looked up from his desk. He had the look of a man who had spent the day expecting something, but not quite this precise. "Clara, I am not asking for your opinion on the decision," she said. "I am informing you of it as you have informed me of yours." She held his gaze. "I would like to handle this with as little additional damage as possible. I think that is in both our interests." He leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man encountering something he had not budgeted for. "You're not going to fight," he said. "I am not going to beg," she said. "If that's what you're asking, no." "That's not—" He stopped. "I meant I expected you to want to argue the case for the marriage, for what we had." Clara looked at him for a moment. What they had. She thought about 8 years of managed crises and invisible work and evenings in the library while he moved through the world accepting credit for the shape of things. "Nathaniel," she said, and her voice was not unkind, which cost her something. "What we had was a situation in which I worked very hard, and you benefited greatly, and neither of us talked about it honestly until it was too late." She paused. "I don't think arguing for that is what either of us actually wants." He was quiet. "I handled last night badly," he said. "Yes. I should have spoken to you privately. I should have—" "Yes," she said again. "You should have done a great many things differently. So should I." She looked at him steadily. "But we are here now, and I intend to move forward, and I hope you will allow that process to be conducted with some dignity." He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment Clara saw something she had not expected to see: uncertainty. Not regret necessarily, she was not willing to assume regret, but the particular expression of a man who had made a large visible decision and was beginning in the cold morning light after to understand its actual dimensions. "Is Caldwell representing you?" he asked. "He is advising me," she said. If the matter requires formal representation, yes. He resigned my account last night. I know. Nathaniel was quiet again. That surprised me, he said. I've known Alexander for 11 years. I did not expect... He did what he thought was right, Clara said. I believe that is something he does with some consistency. She turned toward the door. Clara. His voice had changed, quieter, something stripped of its usual assurance. Will you be... She stopped. She did not turn around. I will be fine, she said. I intend to be. She left. She walked down the hall of Whitmore Estate, past the portraits and the furniture and the rooms she had arranged and managed for 8 years, and she walked upstairs to the bedroom that had been hers, and she began to pack. Not everything. She was not taking everything. She was taking what was hers, specifically personally, undeniably hers, and leaving the rest for lawyers to sort out in due course. Her mother's ring, her books, her account ledgers, her copies of them, which she had kept with the instincts of a woman who understood that the records you keep are the story you can tell. Her father's letter, which she kept in the drawer of her nightstand. The letter he had written her when she married Nathaniel, the letter she had read many times over the years, the letter in which he had said, "My girl, you are smarter than most of the men you'll meet, and the good ones will know it, and the bad ones will be threatened by it. Learn to tell the difference early. It will save you considerable time." She had not learned it early enough. She was learning it now. She packed 2 trunks and sent word to Thomas to arrange transport to Richmond in the morning. Thomas came to find her when she was nearly done. He stood in the doorway and looked at the trunks, and looked at her, and his face did the thing that faces do when a person has been in service long enough to understand that their feelings about a situation are not the primary concern, but cannot always be contained entirely. "Ma'am," he said. "Thomas?" She looked at him. I know it is a disruption. I'm sorry for that. Don't you apologize, ma'am." His voice was careful and firm in equal measure. "You've nothing to apologize for." She looked at him for a moment. "The estate will be fine," she said. "The accounts are in order. The Southfield manager knows what he's doing. The Crawford water arrangement is documented in the top drawer of my writing desk. I'd ask you to make sure Mr. Whitmore is aware of the renewal date, which is in March." Thomas stared at her. She heard what it sounded like saying it. She heard herself in the last hour of packing up 8 years of her life, giving instructions for the smooth continuation of the household she was leaving. She heard the absurdity of it, and the complete inevitability of it in equal parts. She almost laughed. "Old habit," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas's voice was rough. "I'll see to it." "Thank you." She closed the second trunk. "For everything. Over all these years. It was a privilege, ma'am." He meant it, she could tell. Serving under you it was a genuine privilege. She nodded once quickly, because she was not going to cry in front of Thomas. She was simply not. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." She lay in her bed that night, and looked at the ceiling and thought about privilege and service, and the strange economy of a life in which the people who worked for you sometimes saw you more clearly than the person you had married. She thought about Thomas's face. She thought about Cook setting down coffee without being asked. She thought about 8 years of a household really running smoothly and well, because she had cared about the people in it, and they had known she cared, and had responded with the particular loyalty that care actually earns, as opposed to the loyalty that authority merely demands. She had built something real here. She was leaving it. But the building, the actual capacity to build the knowledge of how it was done, that was coming with her. Nobody could leave that behind. Richmond, in August, was a different world from the quiet of Whitmore County, and Clara arrived in it the following afternoon with 2 trunks and the deliberate forward-facing posture of a woman who understood that how she entered a new situation would determine a great deal about how that situation received her. Alexander's mother's house was on a quiet street, and it was, as he had said, furnished and comfortable, and not charity. A distinction she had decided to accept as valid, because the alternative was spending energy on pride that she needed for more important things. He met her there himself, which she had not expected. He was standing at the door when the carriage arrived. He helped with the trunks without making it significant. He showed her through the rooms with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man transferring information, not offering a gift. When the tour was done, they stood in the front parlor. "It's sufficient?" he asked. "It's more than sufficient," she said honestly. "Good." He put on his hat. "I'll leave you to settle, if you need anything." "Alexander?" He stopped. She looked at him. "Why did you really resign Nathaniel's account?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the night of that party," he said, "I watched you walk into a room you had built and be destroyed in it by someone who owed you more than he had ever given. And I made a choice about which side of that I wanted to be on." He paused. "It was not a difficult choice. It cost you considerable business." "Some things cost what they cost," he said, the same words as the night before. She understood now that this was not a rhetorical position for him. It was how he actually made decisions. She nodded. He left. She stood in the front parlor of a house that was not hers, and looked at her 2 trunks and the ring on the desk in the library she had left behind, and she breathed. Then she unpacked. And the next morning, she began. She started by asking to review Whitmore Estate's legal documentation, not because she needed it for her own purposes. Because when she had told Alexander about the accounts, he had noted something she had half-registered and not pursued: the Crawford water arrangement, the Forsyth resolution, the creditor renegotiations. All of these had involved third parties who knew Clara's name and trusted her judgment. None of them had formal documentation that named her specifically. It was the same problem Elizabeth Harrington had uncovered about her own work. The work existed. The record of who had done it did not. Clara intended to fix that. Not for a legal proceeding, though she had not ruled one out. For the simpler, more fundamental reason that the truth of what she had done deserved to exist somewhere in a form that could not be quietly ignored. She wrote letters to the Richmond creditors she had negotiated with in 1812. To the Forsyth associates she had worked with in 1815, to the Crawford family's attorney who had dealt with her directly throughout the water arrangement. She wrote clear, factual, specific letters asking each party to confirm in writing the nature of their dealings with her in those transactions. The responses came back over 10 days. Every one of them confirmed what she had documented. Every one of them, without exception, described her as competent, reliable, and the primary point of contact in the relevant transaction. She organized these responses in a leather portfolio. She showed them to Alexander on the 12th day. He sat in the front parlor of his mother's house and read through them carefully, and when he finished, he set the portfolio down and looked at her with an expression that had moved several degrees past professional respect into something that was harder to name. "You did all of this in 12 days, he said. "I had the relationships already," she said. "I just needed the documentation." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara." He used her given name without formality for the first time, and neither of them remarked on it, because in the context of what was between them, it simply felt accurate. "This portfolio changes the nature of the settlement negotiation significantly." "I know." "Nathaniel's attorney will argue that these transactions were conducted on behalf of the estate, not independently. His attorney will have a difficult time arguing that," Clara said, "because 3 of those letters specifically note that the principals in those transactions requested to work with me personally, that they trusted my judgment specifically. That implies an independent professional standing that was never formally acknowledged, but clearly existed." Alexander looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for 12 days. "I've been thinking about this for 8 years, she said. "I just didn't have a reason to document it until now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and this was the thing she would remember afterward, the moment she would return to when she was working out what had actually happened between them, and why he said, "I think Nathaniel Whitmore may be the most comprehensively foolish man I have ever encountered in a professional capacity." It was not a romantic declaration. It was a legal and personal assessment delivered with the dry precision of a man who meant it exactly as he said it. But Clara Whitmore, sitting in a borrowed parlor in Richmond with a leather portfolio of evidence of her own competence on the table between them, felt something in her chest that she had not felt in quite some time. She felt seen, not managed, not appreciated in the distant way of a man acknowledging a useful resource. Seen. The way a person feels when someone is actually looking at them and registering what is actually there. She said, "He is not the only man who could have looked more carefully." She said it quietly and without accusation, and it included herself as much as anyone. Alexander heard all of it. "No," he said, "he is not." And they sat in that parlor with the portfolio between them and the summer afternoon outside, and something that had been forming quietly for 12 days through legal discussions and practical arrangements and the particular trust that builds between people who deal with each other honestly, settled into a shape that was clearer now than it had been before. Not declared, not rushed, just present, the way real things are. The settlement negotiation began on a Tuesday. Nathaniel's attorney was a man named Greaves Sr., established with the particular confidence of a lawyer who had spent 30 years representing men of property in disputes that almost always resolved in favor of men of property. He arrived at Alexander's office with the careful cordiality of a man who expects to win and is being gracious about it in advance. He stopped being gracious approximately 20 minutes into the meeting. Clara sat across the table from him with Alexander beside her and the leather portfolio in front of her, and she watched Greaves move through the opening positions of the negotiation with the smooth efficiency of a man executing a familiar playbook. He spoke about the estate's assets. He spoke about the contributions of both parties. He spoke with particular delicacy about the circumstances of the separation. Framing them, Clara noticed in language that subtly implied mutual dissatisfaction rather than a public humiliation conducted by one party in front of 200 witnesses. She let him speak. She had learned over 8 years of managing difficult conversations with creditors and business associates that a man who was executing a prepared position was best allowed to finish it before being interrupted, because interrupting him only required him to start over. When he finished, she opened the portfolio. "Mr. Greaves," she said, "I'd like to direct your attention to the first section." He looked at the portfolio, then at her, then at Alexander. "This is a legal proceeding, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Perhaps your counsel. My client is entirely capable of presenting her own documentation," Alexander said pleasantly. "Please proceed, Clara." Greaves's expression moved through something briefly before resettling. Clara turned the first page toward him. She walked him through it the way she had always walked through accounts, methodically. Specifically without embellishment, letting the numbers and the letters and the signed confirmations speak in the plain language of fact. The Richmond creditor correspondence from 1812. The Forsyth resolution documentation from 1815. The Crawford water arrangement confirmation, which included a note from the Crawford family's attorney stating that negotiations had been handled exclusively by Mrs. Clara Whitmore, whose judgment and competence he would be prepared to attest to in any formal proceeding. She turned the last page. She folded her hands on top of the portfolio. "The estate's current financial standing," she said, "is the direct result of decisions made and negotiations conducted by me over 8 years in my capacity as de facto manager of Whitmore Estate's most significant financial relationships. I have third-party confirmation of every item in this portfolio." She paused. "I am not asking for everything, Mr. Greaves. I am asking for what is fair, which is a different and considerably smaller number. But I want to be clear about what the foundation of this negotiation actually is." Greaves looked at the portfolio for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to consult with my client." "Of course," Clara said. He left. Alexander waited until his footsteps had cleared the hall, and then he looked at Clara with an expression that was, for once, not entirely composed. "That," he said, "was one of the finest opening positions I have witnessed in 11 years of legal practice." "It was accurate," Clara said. "Accuracy rarely requires much. Bravery, if you're willing to accept the consequences," he finished. He looked at her. "You remembered." "I pay attention," she said. "It's a habit." "Say it." Greaves returned the following day. He had the look of a man who had had a difficult conversation with his client and had come back to the table with adjusted expectations and no particular pleasure about it. He offered a number. It was better than Clara had expected and worse than she deserved, which was approximately what Alexander had predicted. She counter-offered. Greaves went back to Nathaniel. This exchange happened 3 times over 4 days, which was faster than most negotiations of this kind. A pace Clara attributed partly to Alexander's precision and partly to the fact that Nathaniel Whitmore, whatever his failings as a husband, was not a stupid man, and he had seen the portfolio, and he understood what it meant. On the 4th day, Greaves arrived with a final number that was in Clara's careful assessment within the range of what was genuinely fair, given Virginia law, the estate's documented history, and the social reality of what had occurred at that anniversary party. She looked at Alexander. He gave her a single slight nod. She accepted. There was no drama in the moment. No speeches, no visible emotion, no ceremony. 2 lawyers signed papers. Clara signed papers. Greaves signed papers. It was the most unglamorous possible ending to 8 years of her life, and she found sitting in that office with the pen still in her hand that she was more grateful for the unglamorousness than she would have been for anything more theatrical. Drama would have required her to feel things she was not ready to feel yet. Paperwork just required her signature. She signed. She thought it was over. She thought settlement signed housing secured portfolio. Documented future uncertain, but no longer controlled by someone else's decisions. She thought she had done what needed doing, and now the slower, less urgent work of rebuilding could begin. She had not accounted for Isabella Monroe. 3 weeks after the settlement was signed, a letter arrived at the Richmond house. It was not addressed to Clara. It was addressed to Alexander from a colleague in Charleston, and it arrived in the Morning Post with a notation indicating it was marked urgent. Alexander read it at his office and came to the Richmond house that afternoon without sending word ahead, which was the first thing that told Clara something was wrong. He was a man who respected the formality of announced visits. He knocked on the door, and she had brought Thomas to Richmond, a decision she had not regretted for a single moment, showed him in with the expression of a man who had read something in Alexander's bearing and was calibrating accordingly. Clara was in the front parlor working on correspondence. She looked up when he came in. She knew immediately. "Sit down," she said. "I'd rather—" "Alexander, sit down." He sat. He put the letter on the table between them. "My colleague in Charleston," he said, "has been managing a legal matter there for the past 2 months, a matter involving the Monroe family." He paused. Isabella Monroe's family. Clara looked at the letter. She did not pick it up yet. "Tell me," she said. Alexander took a breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he is organizing difficult information into the most accurate and least damaging sequence. "Isabella Monroe is not simply a woman who fell in love with a married man," he said. "Or more precisely, that may also be true, but it is not the whole of it." He paused. "Her family has been in significant financial difficulty for 3 years. Her father made several poor business decisions in 1815 that left the Monroe estate with debts that their income could not support." He looked at Clara. "Isabella is the eldest daughter. She was, according to my colleague, under considerable family pressure to resolve the situation through marriage." Clara held his gaze. "To someone wealthy." "To someone wealthy," he confirmed. "And specifically to someone whose wealth was managed in a way that could be restructured to address the Monroe debts without being immediately visible." He paused again. "My colleague has documentation suggesting that Isabella's approach to Nathaniel was not entirely spontaneous, that her family had identified Whitmore Estate as a potential solution to their financial problem before she was introduced to him socially." The silence in the parlor was absolute. Clara did not speak for a long moment. She thought about Isabella Monroe standing at the far end of that ballroom in her deep blue gown, waiting to be introduced to the room as the woman Nathaniel's heart had always belonged to. She thought about the arrangement of it, the careful staging, the timing, The public nature of the declaration that had made retreat impossible for everyone involved. She thought about the fact that Isabella Munro had known exactly what she was doing. And then she thought about something else. "Alexander," she said slowly. "Nathaniel didn't know." "I believe that's correct. He thought it was love." "I think he believed what he wanted to believe," Alexander said carefully. "Which is not the same as being deceived necessarily, but he walked into someone else's plan," Clara said. "The way a man does when he wants something badly enough that he stops asking why it's being offered so easily." She thought about that. She thought about Nathaniel's face in his study the night she told him she was leaving the uncertainty she had seen there, the thing she had read as regret for consequences rather than regret for action. She was not sure now that she had read it correctly. She was not sure of anything about Nathaniel Whitmore's interior life, which was, she reflected, the central problem of their entire marriage. "What is your colleague's legal involvement?" she asked. "One of the Munro creditors has engaged him to investigate the family's assets. Isabella was named in that investigation because—" Alexander paused. "Because she recently entered into a legal agreement with Nathaniel Whitmore regarding Whitmore Estate." Clara went still. "What kind of agreement?" Alexander looked at her steadily. "A betrothal agreement," he said. "Signed 6 weeks ago, which is 4 weeks after I left." Clara's voice was flat. "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him for a moment. Not because she needed to hide her face. She had passed well beyond the point where Nathaniel Whitmore's decisions affected her in the raw, immediate way of early grief, but because she needed 10 seconds to organize what she was feeling before she said anything. What she felt was not jealousy. She was clear on that immediately. What she felt was the particular anger of a woman who has been careful and methodical and honest in exiting a difficult situation only to discover that the situation had not been what she was told it was when she was deciding how to exit it. She turned back. "He told me his heart had always belonged to her," she said. "I know." "He said that in front of 200 people." "I know. And 6 weeks later he signs a betrothal agreement." She looked at Alexander. Did he love her? Does he love her? Or was this— "I don't know what Nathaniel Whitmore feels," Alexander said honestly. "I don't think I ever did. I'm not certain he does." He paused. "What I know is that he is about to enter a legal and financial arrangement with a woman whose family intends to use that arrangement to resolve their own debts, and that he is doing so without, I believe, any understanding of that intention." Clara was quiet. She thought about 8 years of protecting Nathaniel from problems he didn't know existed. She thought about intercepted creditor letters and managed crises and the steady, quiet work of standing between a careless man and the consequences of his carelessness. She thought about how that had worked out for her. She sat back down. "That is no longer my problem," she said. "No," Alexander agreed. "It isn't. It isn't," she said again. Silence. "He's going to walk into this without seeing it," she said. "Probably. And the estate is no longer. I know." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I know it is no longer my concern. I know that." She looked at the letter. "But the people in it are." Alexander looked at her. "Thomas is here," she said. "But Cook is still there. The Southfield manager. James, who has been working in the accounts office since March." She paused. "People I am responsible for in the ways that matter, regardless of what any legal document says." "Clara." Alexander's voice was quiet. "You cannot protect everyone. I am not trying to protect everyone." She met his eyes. "I am trying to decide what my actual obligations are, as opposed to my habitual ones, and whether there is a distinction." He was quiet for a moment. "What would Elizabeth Harrington do?" he said. It was not a rhetorical question. It landed the way he intended it, as a real reference point, a woman who had faced a version of this problem, and whose choices had become, in the past year, a kind of landmark in how people thought about such things. Clara thought about it seriously. She would document it, Clara said. She wouldn't intervene directly. She wouldn't try to save him. She had learned that lesson. But she would make sure the documentation existed so that when the truth came out, it could be seen clearly. She paused. She would protect the people who couldn't protect themselves, and she would leave the rest to work out as it must. Alexander nodded slowly. Then that, he said, is what we do. He gave her the letter from his Charleston colleague. Not to keep, but to read fully to understand the complete picture of what the Monroe family had done and how they had done it, because understanding a thing completely was, as Clara had always known, the prerequisite to dealing with it correctly. She read it that evening. It was more detailed than Alexander's summary and more disturbing. The Monroe family's financial situation was not simply the result of poor decisions in 1815. It was the result of a systematic pattern of overextension, borrowing against assets that did not support the debt, entering into arrangements that looked productive on paper, and collapsed in practice, deferring consequences through a combination of social standing and Isabella's strategic marriages. Not her first. That was the piece Alexander had not mentioned in his summary, or had mentioned, and she had not fully heard. Isabella Monroe had been married before. In 1814, she had married a man named Reeves in South Carolina, a man of good family and moderate wealth who had died in 1816, leaving his estate to Isabella. That estate had, within a year of Isabella's inheritance, been significantly reduced, with assets transferred to Monroe family accounts in arrangements that the Charleston creditor's attorney was now contesting. Isabella Monroe was not a woman who had been swept away by passion for Nathaniel Whitmore. She was a woman who had twice now identified a man of property and positioned herself to benefit from proximity to that property. Clara set down the letter. She sat with what she had just read for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote two things. The first was a letter to Cook at Whitmore Estate, asking after the household, and noting that Clara hoped the seasonal accounts were proceeding smoothly, and that if there was anything concerning the household arrangements that Cook felt ought to be addressed, Clara was always willing to listen. It was not a letter that said, "There is something you need to know." It was a letter that said, between its careful lines, "I am still here. I am still paying attention. If you need me, you know where I am." The second was a note to Alexander. Alexander, the Charleston documentation changes the nature of what we know, but not, I think, what we should do. I agree with the position we discussed. Document protect. Where we can, do not intervene where it is not our place. But there is one thing I believe we have an obligation to do, and I would like to discuss it with you. Can you come tomorrow morning? C. She sent both letters. She did not sleep well that night. Not because of grief. She was past the grief of Nathaniel Whitmore, or near enough that the distinction no longer mattered. She did not sleep because she was thinking about obligation and its limits, about the difference between a habitual protectiveness and a genuine one, about what it meant to see something happening and have the capacity to intervene and choose not to. She was thinking about whether silence in this case was the same as complicity. Alexander came at 9. She had coffee ready, which was not a gesture she made consciously, but which he acknowledged with a brief nod that meant more than a formal thank you would have. They sat. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking about Nathaniel," she said. "Specifically, I'm thinking about whether he deserves to know." Alexander was quiet. "He humiliated you publicly," he said. "He ended your marriage in front of 200 people without the courtesy of a private conversation. He signed a betrothal agreement 4 weeks after you left, and has, by all accounts, made no effort to understand what he did or why it was wrong. I know all of that. Then I want to understand what leads you toward telling him." Clara looked at her coffee. "Because knowing it happened to me doesn't make me feel better about it happening to him," she said. "Because watching someone walk into a situation I could have prevented, even someone who hurt me, is not something I can do with an easy conscience." She paused. "And because if I say nothing and he loses the estate to Isabella Monroe's family's debts, the people in that house lose their livelihoods. and that I cannot justify with the argument that it's not my problem anymore." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. She had been thinking about this since last night, and she could see him thinking about it now, really thinking, not looking for the logical flaw in her position, but genuinely working through it. "If we tell him," he said carefully, "he will want to know how we know. And the answer to that question will reveal that I have been in contact with a colleague in Charleston who has been investigating the Monroe family." "Is that a problem?" "Nathaniel could argue that I am acting against his interests, that having resigned his account and taken up yours, I am now conducting intelligence operations against him." "Are you—" He looked at her. "No," he said. "My colleague contacted me because the Monroe investigation touched on Whitmore estate documents that are technically still in my firm's archive from when I represented Nathaniel. He informed me as a professional courtesy." He paused. "That is the truth, and it is legally defensible." "Then we tell him," Clara said. "It will not make him grateful," Alexander said. "Very possibly the opposite." "I'm not doing it to be thanked." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know that," he said. "I know exactly that." And the way he said it quietly, directly, with the particular tone of a man who means something more than what his words technically contain, made Clara very still for a moment. She held his gaze. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Of course." They went to Whitmore Estate on a Thursday. Clara had sent a letter ahead, brief, neutral, requesting a meeting on a matter of legal importance. She had not told Nathaniel what the matter was, because the nature of this particular truth required the full picture to be present when it was delivered, not distributed in pieces that would allow him to prepare his defenses before she could put down all the evidence. The carriage ride was 2 hours. They did not speak much. Not from awkwardness. The silence between them was not awkward, which was itself something Clara was aware of and did not spend time analyzing because some things were better understood in retrospect. They were met at the door by the new housekeeper, someone Clara did not know, which meant Nathaniel had made changes. That was, she supposed, his right. They were shown into the formal parlor, not the library, not the small parlor. The formal one, the one Nathaniel used for business. He was establishing from the first room choice that this was a professional encounter. She found that she did not mind. Nathaniel came in 5 minutes later. He was dressed well, which meant he had prepared, which meant the letter had made him anxious even without details. He looked at Clara, then at Alexander. His face moved through something quickly. "Clara," he said. "Nathaniel." She did not stand. "Thank you for seeing us." He sat across from them. He looked, she thought, tired. Not the tiredness of a man who had been physically taxed, but the tiredness of a man who had been living inside a decision that was not behaving the way he had expected. "You said there was a legal matter," he said. "There is," she said, "though it is perhaps more accurately described as information you need to have, which has legal implications." He looked at Alexander. "Are you here as her counsel?" he said. "I'm here as someone who has information relevant to your situation," Alexander said. "The professional context is less important than the content, which I'd ask you to hear completely before responding." Nathaniel looked at them both. "Go ahead," he said. Clara did not soften it. She had thought about this on the carriage ride, whether to soften it, how much, whether kindness required a gentler approach. She had decided no. Not because she wanted to hurt him, but because the full truth clearly stated was the only thing that would actually reach him. He had spent 8 years receiving softened versions of difficult realities. He needed the clear one. She told him about the Monroe family's finances, about the pattern of debt and strategic marriage, about the Reeves estate in South Carolina and what had happened to it after Isabella inherited, about the betrothal agreement and what Alexander's colleague had identified as the Monroe family's likely intent. She put the documentation on the table. She did not interpret it for him. She laid it down and let him read. He read for a long time. The room was completely quiet. When he looked up, his face had changed in a way that Clara had not seen in 8 years of knowing him. Something cracked in it. Not dramatically, not the way faces crack in theatrical performances. Just a small, fundamental fracture in the surface of a man's certainty about something he had built his recent actions around. "This is accurate," he said. His voice was different. "My colleague is reliable," Alexander said. "The documentation is from creditor proceedings in South Carolina. It is public record." Nathaniel looked at Clara. She held his gaze and did not look away. "She was—" He stopped. "I don't know what she feels," Clara said. "I only know what I've shown you." She paused. "What she intended, that is, in the documents." He looked down at the papers. "Why are you telling me?" he said. You have no obligation to, after what I—" He stopped again. The sentence was not finishing itself because none of the endings were comfortable. "Because the people in this house deserve better than the consequences of a situation they had no part in creating," Clara said. "And because whatever happened between us, I am not the kind of person who watches someone walk toward a cliff and says nothing because they were unkind to me." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. And in that look was something Clara recognized finally, for what it was: the expression of a man who had just understood genuinely from the inside, without the protection of pride or justification, what he had lost. Not the thing he had thought he'd lost. The real thing. The thing that had been in front of him for 8 years. "Clara," he said, and his voice broke slightly on the word, the way a voice breaks when a person is not going to cry, but is close enough to it that the effort shows. I don't know how to." "You don't need to say it now," she said. "I need to say something." "Then say it when you know what it actually is," she said. "Not before." She stood. Alexander stood. She picked up one copy of the Charleston documentation, the copy she had brought for Nathaniel, and left it on the table. She kept the other. "You will want to speak to a lawyer," she said. "Not Alexander, his conflict is too apparent now, but a good one, quickly." Nathaniel nodded. He was still sitting. He looked, she thought, smaller than she had ever seen him look. Not diminished, just human in a way that his certainty had always prevented. She moved toward the door. "Clara." His voice was quiet. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For I know you didn't have to." She turned and looked at him one last time. "No," she said. "I didn't." She left. The carriage was halfway back to Richmond before either of them spoke. Alexander broke the silence. "You were right to tell him," he said. "I know. It will not change what he did. I know that too. Then what are you feeling?" Clara looked out the window at the Virginia countryside, moving past the same countryside she had looked at for 8 years from a different carriage, going in a different direction, belonging to a different version of her life. "I'm feeling," she said slowly, "like I just put something down that I've been carrying for a very long time, and my arms are lighter than I expected." She paused. "And I'm feeling like the woman who did what I just did in that room is someone I would like to keep being." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "She is someone worth keeping," he said. Clara turned from the window and looked at him. And this time, in this carriage on this road, she did not look away. Neither did he. The carriage ride back to Richmond took 2 hours. Clara spent the first hour looking out the window and not speaking, and Alexander respected that with the particular quality of silence that belongs to a man who understands the difference between a person who is shutting down and a person who is processing. She was processing. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands were still in her lap, rather than restless, the way her expression was not grief or anger, but something more concentrated and interior. He waited. She turned from the window at the 1-hour mark as though she had finished with something, and was now ready to rejoin the world. "He's going to dissolve the betrothal," she said. "Probably," Alexander agreed. "And Isabella will return to Charleston. Her family will look elsewhere," he said. "They are practical people in the way that people running from consequences tend to be practical." He paused. "She will be all right in the material sense. I want to be honest about that. What she did was wrong, but she was also operating under considerable family pressure and—" And none of that is mine to sort out, Clara said, not unkindly, just precisely. I know. I made my peace with that in the carriage on the way there. He looked at her. You made your peace with it in the carriage on the way there, he repeated. I had 2 hours. Most people take considerably longer. I'm not most people, she said simply. And then she smiled, not the social smile she had been deploying all her life, the gracious, arranged expression of a woman who knew how to be pleasant in rooms. A real one. Small, slightly tired, entirely genuine. Also, I have been practicing putting things down that don't belong to me. I've had considerable recent experience. Alexander looked at that smile for a moment longer than he had intended to. He looked away. Clara, he said. Yes. He organized what he wanted to say. He was a man who organized his words before speaking them, who had learned over decades of legal work that imprecision caused damage that was difficult to repair. He had always believed in saying things exactly right the first time. He had been waiting for the exact right thing to say to this woman for some time now, and he was becoming increasingly aware that waiting for it was its own kind of imprecision. I need to tell you something, he said, and I want to be clear that it is entirely separate from your legal situation, which is resolved, and from the matter we attended to today, which is also resolved. It is entirely separate from any professional context. She had gone still, not the stillness of alarm, the stillness of a person who is listening with their full attention. Go ahead, she said. I told you the night of the party that I spoke because what happened to you was wrong, and because I thought someone should say so. He paused. That was true. It was not, however, the entire truth. Clara waited. The entire truth, he said, is that I have been aware of you specifically distinctly as a person I wanted to know better for approximately 3 years. And I handled that awareness by maintaining a professional distance that was appropriate given the circumstances, and by not examining it too carefully, because examining it would have required me to acknowledge something I had no right to act on. He looked at her directly. I want to acknowledge it now. Not because your circumstances have changed, and therefore it is suddenly acceptable. I am aware of how that would look, and I want to be clear that is not what this is. Another pause. I am telling you, because I think you deserve to know where I stand, and because I am 41 years old, and I am done having thoughts I don't say. The carriage moved beneath them. Clara was quiet for a long moment. 3 years, she said. Yes. Since the Crawford water negotiation. He blinked. How did you... Because that was the first time we had a substantive conversation, she said. And I noticed you noticing me, and I told myself I was imagining it because it was easier. She looked at him steadily. And then I went home to Nathaniel and I told myself a great many other things because it was easier than examining what I was actually feeling. The silence between them was very full. Clara, he said carefully, I am not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. You have been through what you have been through, and you are building something new. And the last thing I want is for you to feel any pressure to Alexander. She said his name the way she had said it in the settlement negotiation clearly, with the particular precision of a woman who knew what she meant, and meant it completely. Stop managing me. He stopped. She looked at him. I am 32 years old, she said. I have spent 8 years being managed and protected from difficult information and handled carefully by people who thought they knew what was best for me. I am done with that. She paused. I appreciate what you are doing. I can see that you are trying to be careful. But careful in this context is starting to look like the thing you do when you don't trust me to handle what's true. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, she said. Just say what you actually mean. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I would like very much to know you better. In whatever way you are willing to allow, at whatever pace makes sense, with no obligation attached. He paused. That is what I mean. Clara looked at him for a moment that stretched and settled. That, she said, is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in quite some time. The carriage rolled into Richmond as the sun began its descent, and neither of them said anything further, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Clara Whitmore had experienced in recent memory. The following weeks moved with the particular rhythm of a life being quietly reconstructed. Clara had the leather portfolio, the Richmond house, a legal settlement that gave her breathing room, and a growing list of professional contacts who had replied to her letters with the confirmation she needed. She had Thomas, who managed the household with the same steadiness he had always managed it with, and who had adapted to Richmond with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had always understood that his loyalty was to a person rather than a place. What she did not have was a purpose. That was the thing no one warned you about, she discovered. The battle of the immediate aftermath. The settlement, the housing, the documentation was structured. It had tasks and timelines and clear measures of success. It was the kind of problem she was genuinely good at. But the morning she woke up and realized the immediate crisis was resolved, and she now had to decide what her actual life was that morning, was harder than any of the preceding ones. She told Alexander about it on a Tuesday in the front parlor, over the coffee that had become a morning habit between them with the naturalness of things that begin without announcement. "I don't know what I'm building," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to build?" She was quiet for a moment. It was the kind of question that sounded simple and was not. 8 years ago, she said, I built someone else's estate. I made it work. I was genuinely good at it. The accounts, the creditor relationships, the management decisions, I was better at all of it than Nathaniel was, and we both knew that, and neither of us ever said it directly, and I spent 8 years living inside that silence. She paused. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to build something for someone else to stand in front of. Then don't, he said, as though it were simple. The law does not give women many options for independent. The law, as currently written, he said, does not prohibit a woman of means from engaging in property management as a business, particularly in the capacity of consulting for families or estates who need that expertise. He paused. I am not suggesting you need my advice on this. I am suggesting that what you have done is something people pay for, and that there is no legal barrier to you being paid for it. Clara looked at him. You've been thinking about this, she said. For about 2 weeks, he admitted. I did not want to raise it until you did. Because you didn't want to manage me. Because it was your problem to arrive at. She sat with that. She thought about the Crawford family's attorney, who had written in his letter that he would be prepared to attest to her competence in any formal proceeding. She thought about the Richmond creditors who had confirmed her negotiating skill. She thought about 3 years of contacts people who had worked with her, directly trusted her judgment, known her name, who were scattered across Virginia in households and business dealings that had not stopped needing exactly the kind of management she had provided. She thought about what it would mean to be paid for that. Not as someone's wife, not as an appendage to someone else's name. As herself. It would be unconventional, she said. You walked out of a ballroom with 200 people watching and didn't make a sound, Alexander said. I think unconventional is well within your capacity. Clara almost laughed. She did not quite laugh, but it was close. The first inquiry came from a source she did not expect. 3 weeks after her conversation with Alexander, a letter arrived from the Pemberton family, the same Pembertons, whose water rights had been affected by Aldridge's manipulation, the same family she had heard about through Elizabeth Harrington's story. The letter was from Mrs. Pemberton, addressed directly to Clara, and it was specific and practical in the way of a woman who had been thinking something through carefully before she committed it to paper. She had heard Mrs. Pemberton wrote about Clara's portfolio, about the documentation and the settlement and the professional confirmation she had gathered. She had also heard through the particular intelligence network of Virginia women who paid attention to things about what Clara had done for the estate at Whitmore over 8 years. She had an estate of her own that was struggling with a creditor situation she did not fully understand and that her husband was handling by ignoring it. She would like Clara's advice. Clara read the letter twice. Then she went to find Alexander. He was in his study. He had been working from the Richmond house with increasing frequency, a fact neither of them had commented on, because commenting on it would have required naming something they were both content to let develop at its own pace. She set the letter on his desk. He read it. He looked up. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "Are you going to take it?" She looked at the letter. She thought about Elizabeth Harrington, sitting in her library, with ledgers and correspondence, managing an estate and a set of relationships with no formal standing and no public acknowledgement. She thought about what Elizabeth had wanted, not for herself, but for the women who came after her. The gathering at Harrington Estate every 3rd of November. The story that had spread across Virginia and was still spreading. The particular kind of example that changes what other people think is possible. She thought about herself, about what she wanted. "Yes," she said, "but not the way Nathaniel used me. I want a written agreement, a fee. Clear terms for the engagement and clear terms for its conclusion." She paused. "I want to be a professional Alexander, not a helpful woman whose contributions are noted gratefully and not compensated." He looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his version of genuine feeling, not performed emotion, not the social warmth of a man managing a room. The real thing. Quiet and steady and completely sincere. "I'll draft the agreement," he said. "I'll review it," she said. "I would expect nothing less." Betted. She met with Mrs. Pemberton the following week. Helen Pemberton was 53, sharp-eyed, and had the manner of a woman who had spent decades being significantly more perceptive than the people around her gave her credit for. She sat across from Clara in the small parlor of the Richmond house, and she looked at Clara with a frankness that Clara found immediately comfortable. "I've heard about you," Helen said, "more than you probably know." "What have you heard?" "That you managed Whitmore Estate for 8 years, and your husband spent those 8 years being complimented on it." She said it plainly, without embellishment. "And that when he made a fool of himself publicly, you walked out without making a scene, hired a lawyer, and had a settlement in hand before most women in your situation would have stopped crying." She paused. "I also heard about Elizabeth Harrington's gathering, that you were there." Clara had been the previous November. She had not known Elizabeth personally, but she had felt the pull of that gathering, the way you feel the pull of something that is about your own life, even when it is ostensibly about someone else's. "I was," she said. "Good." Helen folded her hands. "Then you understand why I came to you, rather than to my husband's attorney." "Tell me about the creditor situation," Clara said. Helen told her. It took 40 minutes, and Clara asked questions throughout, specific questions, the kind that are asked by someone who understands the subject matter and needs particular information, rather than someone who is gathering a general picture. Helen answered them with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to have this conversation with someone competent for some time. When they finished, Clara sat back. "The situation is recoverable," she said. "It's not easy, and it will take time, but there is a path through it that doesn't require selling the property." She paused. "Your husband is going to be part of this because legally he has to be. But the approach I would recommend is one that I've used before." She thought of 1812, of 1815, of Nathaniel, standing in the foreground of a picture he didn't know Clara had painted. "And it works best when the person managing the relationships with the creditors is someone they trust and respect." "Which means you," Helen said. "Which means me," Clara agreed. "With appropriate documentation of my role, a clear engagement agreement, and the understanding that decisions of significant consequence will be presented to your husband for signature, with full explanation of why they are the right decisions." Helen looked at her. "Not around him," Clara said. "With him, but led by me." She paused. "That is the arrangement I am offering." Helen was quiet for a moment. "What will it cost?" Clara told her. Helen did not blink. "When can you start?" she said. "Mamandan." That was the first. Within 2 months there were 3 more. The referrals came through the same network that had brought Mrs. Pemberton the invisible but efficient channel of Virginia women who talked to each other about what was actually working and what was not. They came from women who were managing household crises that their husbands were either unaware of or unwilling to address, from families where the accounts were stretched and the creditors were restless and the person who understood the situation best had no formal standing to address it. Clara developed a practice. She called it, when she described it to Alexander, who had become in the most natural way imaginable her closest professional confidant and the person she most wanted to tell things to. She called it estate consultation. Not management, because management implied a permanence that frightened people. Consultation. An engagement with a beginning and an end, and clear terms and a written agreement. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference was that now she was good at it on her own behalf, with her own name on the agreement and her own fee in the accounting, and her own decisions about which engagements to accept and which to decline. The first time she declined an engagement, a family in Fredericksburg whose situation was recoverable, but whose patriarch made it clear in the first meeting that he intended to be consulted on every decision she made, which made her the consultant. In name only, the first time she said no and meant it, and walked away. She felt something she had not felt in longer than she could accurately remember. She felt like herself, fully herself, not performing capability for someone else's benefit, not managing someone else's comfort, just competent and recognized for it, and in charge of the recognition. She told Alexander about the Fredericksburg family that evening. He was in the study, his study now, by common understanding, the room he worked in when he was at the Richmond house, which was most days. The line between his professional presence and his personal one had been moving gradually for weeks in the way that lines move when nobody is making a decision about them, but both parties are quietly okay with the direction. "I said no," she said, "and it felt completely right." He looked up from his papers. "Tell me." She told him. He listened with the quality of attention that she had come to rely on, not the listening of a man waiting to offer solutions, but the listening of a man who understood that being heard was sometimes the thing that mattered. When she finished, he said, "You're learning to choose." "I always had opinions," she said. "I just spent 8 years not knowing I was allowed to act on them. And now—" She looked at him. The room was quiet. The house around them was settled and still in the way that evening houses are when they have been lived in correctly. She thought about how different this quiet was from the quiet of Whitmore Estate. This was not the quiet of absence of two people maintaining separate lives under the same roof. This was the quiet of a space that was genuinely shared. "Now," she said, "I'm deciding what I want, deliberately." She paused. It's a different thing than simply reacting. Alexander set down his pen. He stood up. He crossed to where she was standing in the doorway of the study, and he stopped at the distance of a man who understands that proximity is a statement, and wants the statement to be understood before he makes it. "Clara," he said, "I have been conducting myself for the past 3 months with the care of a man who does not want to be another situation you have to manage." He paused. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer directly without consideration for what I might want to hear." "Go ahead," she said. "Is what is between us, what has been developing between us, is it something you want? Not something you are willing to accept, or grateful for, or comfortable with. Something you actually want." She looked at him. She thought about the ballroom, about her mother's ring, about the portfolio and the first client, and the Fredericksburg family, and the particular sensation of saying no, and meaning it, and feeling right. She thought about what it felt like to come home to a house where someone was in the study with the lamp on and papers spread out, and the particular comfort of knowing that the person there was glad she was back. She thought about choosing. "Yes," she said, "I want it." She held his gaze. Entirely specifically, and not as a consolation for anything else. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He took her hand. Not dramatically, he just reached out and took her hand, the way a man takes the hand of a woman he intends to stay beside, simple and steady and without theater. "Good," he said. She looked at their hands. "That's all," she said. "For now," he said. "We have time." She thought we have time. She thought I have never been told that before, not in a way I believed. She believed it now. 3 weeks later, Nathaniel Whitmore came to Richmond. He sent a letter ahead, formal brief, requesting a meeting at a neutral location at her convenience. Clara showed it to Alexander, who read it and looked at her with the steady expression of a man who was not going to tell her what to do. "Do you want to see him?" Alexander asked. "Yes," she said, not with eagerness, with the particular clarity of a woman who has something to say and has found the right moment to say it. She met Nathaniel at a coffee house near the center of town, neutral ground public enough to prevent emotional escalation, private enough for a real conversation. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when he saw her, which he had not always done in the later years of their marriage. She noticed that without commenting on it. She sat. He sat. He looked different than he had when she had brought him the Isabella Munro documentation. Less disassembled, but also she searched for the word smaller, not in stature, in the particular way a man seems smaller when he has put down the certainty he was using to take up space. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said it was important." "I dissolved the betrothal," he said. "3 weeks ago. He stopped. "I confronted Isabella with what you brought me. She did not. She was not entirely dishonest with me, but she was not entirely honest either. And when I pressed her on the family's financial situation, He paused. "She was more pragmatic about it than I had expected." "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment. "She said she had grown genuinely fond of me," he said, "and that the two things were not mutually exclusive." A pause. "I think she believed that. I'm not certain it matters." Clara looked at him. "Are you all right?" she asked. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're asking if I'm all right." "I'm asking because I want to know not to be kind." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said honestly. "I'm not entirely all right. I have been doing considerable thinking over the past several weeks." He looked down at his coffee. "About the estate. About what you told me. About—" He stopped. "About the 8 years before any of this." Clara waited. "I didn't see it," he said. "What you were doing. I knew the estate ran well. I knew things got managed. But I took it the way you take air, you breathe it, and it's simply there, and you don't think about what's making it possible until it stops." He looked up. "That was wrong. I know that. I knew it that night in the study when you told me you were leaving, but I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't know it the way you know something that changes you until later." "Has it changed you?" she asked. "I'm trying," he said. That's the honest answer. "I'm trying." Clara looked at him. She thought about Elizabeth Harrington's final letter. "I forgave you before I died, and I did it freely, not because you earned it, but because holding unforgiveness costs too much." She thought about what it had cost her in the last year to carry anger at Nathaniel alongside everything else she was building. She thought about the weight of it, and she made a decision. "Nathaniel," she said, "I want to say something clearly so there is no ambiguity between us." He looked at her. "I am not coming back," she said. "Not to the marriage, not to the estate, not to any version of the life we had. That is entirely finished, and I want you to know that it is finished without any possibility of revision." "I know that," he said quietly. "And I am not offering friendship," she continued. "I don't know yet if we can be something to each other or what that something might look like. That would require time and proof that you mean what you're saying about trying." She paused. "What I am saying is this: I forgive you. Not because you've earned it yet, but because I am building a life that I actually want, and I cannot build it while I'm carrying what you did to me." She looked at him steadily. "I'm putting it down. For myself. Not for you." Nathaniel was very still. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Probably," she said. "But it's what I'm choosing." She stood. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, this formal, final, honest gesture, and then he stood and shook it. "I hope you're well," he said. "I mean that, Clara, whatever it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." But she left the coffee house and walked out into the Richmond afternoon, and the summer air was warm and full of the particular life of a city that didn't care about her past and had nothing invested in her future. She walked. She thought about what she had just done, about the weight she had just set down, how her arms felt, how the afternoon felt around her. She thought about the Richmond house. She thought about Alexander in the study with his papers. She thought about building. She walked faster. She had somewhere to be. She walked back to the Richmond house faster than she had walked anywhere in months. Not from urgency, exactly, more from the particular energy of a person who has just put down something heavy and discovered that their legs work better without it. The afternoon was warm, and the streets were busy with the ordinary commerce of a city going about its business, and Clara moved through it with the purposeful step of a woman who knew where she was going. Thomas opened the door before she knocked. He had a talent for that. "Mr. Caldwell is in the study, ma'am," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Thomas." She went to the study. Alexander was at the desk exactly as she had pictured him. Papers spread, pen in hand, the particular concentration of a man engaged with something that required his full attention. He looked up when she came in, read her face in the way he had learned to read her face, which was thoroughly and without asking her to explain herself. "How did it go?" he said. "I told him I forgive him," she said. Alexander set down his pen. "And," he said, "and I mean it." She sat in the chair across from his desk. "Not for him. It has very little to do with him at this point. But I have been carrying the anger at what he did alongside everything I'm building, and the two things don't fit together. The building takes space. The anger takes space." She looked at Alexander. "I chose the building." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I put down something heavy," she said. "And like I would like a cup of tea, and to tell you about the Pemberton account because I've been thinking about the March creditor meeting, and I have 3 ideas, and I want your legal opinion on the second one specifically." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and went to the door and called for Thomas to bring tea, and came back and sat down and said, "Tell me the second idea first." That was the thing about Alexander Caldwell. He always knew which part was the actual point. The Pemberton situation resolved in 6 weeks. Not easily. Nothing genuinely difficult resolves easily, and Clara had learned to distrust solutions that presented themselves as easy. But it resolved correctly, which was more important. 2 creditors agreed to restructured payment schedules. The third required more convincing, which Clara provided in the form of a meeting in Richmond, in which she laid out the Pemberton estate's actual asset picture with the precision of someone who had spent 3 weeks understanding it better than the creditor himself did, and then proposed terms that were fair to both parties without being generous to either. The creditor agreed. He also, and this was the thing Clara noted and filed away for future use, asked for her card. She had cards printed the following week. It was not a dramatic decision. She ordered them from the printer on Market Street and collected them when they were ready and put them in her bag. And the first time she handed one to a potential client, she felt something she could not immediately name. She named it later in conversation with Alexander. "Real," she said. "It felt real. Not like a role I was playing inside someone else's life. Like my actual life." He looked at her with that quiet, steady expression. "It is your actual life," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing. I know it now." Gone. The inquiry that changed everything came in October. It came from a man named Hargrove, a Richmond businessman with interests in several properties across 3 counties, and a reputation for being particular about who he trusted with financial matters. He had been referred to Clara by the Crawford family's attorney, who had apparently been singing her praises to anyone who would listen, which she had not known, and which the attorney confirmed with some embarrassment when she wrote to thank him. Hargrove's inquiry was different from the others. It was not a household in crisis. It was not a wife managing a situation her husband didn't know about. It was a formal business inquiry, addressed to her name requesting a consultation on the reorganization of 3 separate property accounts that had become tangled through poor record-keeping and several ill-advised arrangements made in rapid succession over the previous 2 years. It was, in short, a professional engagement. Not personal management. Not quiet intervention. Professional consultation offered to her directly on her professional merits. She read the letter 3 times. Then she went to Alexander. He read it once. He looked up. "This is what you've been building toward," he said. "I didn't know I was building toward it specifically," she said. "I think you did," he said. "I think you knew from the moment you sat down with that portfolio in my office." He held the letter out. "Are you going to take it?" She took the letter back. She thought about 8 years of work that had no name attached to it. She thought about her name on those printed cards. She thought about Elizabeth Harrington, who had built something essential and invisible, and had trusted in the end that the work itself would be the record. Clara did not want to be invisible. She had been invisible long enough. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to take it." She wrote back to Hargrove that afternoon. Professional, precise, outlining her terms and her process, and the documentation she would require before beginning. No softening, no excessive courtesy. The letter of a professional to a client. Hargrove replied within 3 days. He agreed to every term. She was 3 weeks into the Hargrove engagement when the twist came. Not from Hargrove himself. The engagement was proceeding well as she had expected it to, because she was good at this, and she now knew she was good at this, and the knowing made a measurable difference to the quality of the work. The twist came from Alexander. He came to find her on a Thursday morning with the expression she had learned to associate with information he had been sitting on long enough that it was time to put it on the table. She put down her pen. "Tell me," she said. He sat. "I received a communication yesterday," he said, "from a colleague in Charlottesville. He has been approached by a group of men landowners, 3 of them, who are interested in forming a land management consortium." He paused. "A legitimate one. They want to retain someone with documented expertise in estate management, creditor, negotiation, and financial reorganization." Another pause. "They want to retain that person in a formal capacity. Consulting partnership." Clara was very still. "They approached you," she said. "They approached my firm," he said, "and my colleague referred them to me. And I am referring them to you because you are the person they actually need, and because I think you should hear the proposal before you decide anything." She looked at him. "A partnership," she said, "with 3 landowners. With 3 men who are by my colleague's assessment straightforward and serious about what they're building." He paused. "Clara, this is a different scale. This is not a household here and a creditor meeting there. This is an ongoing formal arrangement that would establish you publicly, not quietly, not through referrals, publicly as a named professional partner." She heard what he was saying. She heard all of it, the opportunity and the risk, and the thing underneath that he was not saying directly, but that she could read in his face. "You're worried," she said. "I'm not worried," he said. "I'm aware that this kind of visibility is also a kind of vulnerability. People who are publicly established can be publicly challenged, and you are not fully past the circumstances of the past year in terms of public perception." She looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me this to talk me out of it?" "No, immediately. I'm telling you this because you deserve to make the decision with full information. Not because I doubt your capacity to handle what comes with it." He met her eyes. "I have never doubted that." Clara was quiet. She thought about the night of that party, about 200 people deciding the shape of what they had witnessed. About the whispers she must have failed him. Perhaps she was never enough that had moved through that room like weather. She thought about how much ground she had covered since that night. She thought about her name on those cards. "Set up the meeting," she said. The meeting with the 3 landowners took place on the 2nd Tuesday of October. Alexander was there, not as her counsel, not formally, but present the way he was present in most things that mattered. She had not asked him to come. He had offered briefly, and she had said yes briefly, and neither of them had made more of it than it was, which was a man who wanted to be there for a woman he cared about, and a woman who was glad to have him. She was not nervous. This surprised her even in the moment. She had expected to be nervous. The old Clara, the Clara of 2 years ago, who had stood in her husband's formal parlor, greeting guests she had invited to an event that would destroy her, that Clara would have been nervous, would have managed the nerves into a gracious exterior and let them eat at her internally. This, Clara sat down across from 3 serious men in a serious room, and felt clearly and without performance entirely herself. The meeting lasted 2 hours. She asked more questions than they did. She requested documentation before the meeting had been going 30 minutes because she needed to understand the actual state of the properties before she could assess whether her involvement was appropriate. The men Harrington County landowners, all 3 with the particular directness of men who had built things with their hands and their decisions and did not have patience for decorative conversation, looked at her when she requested the documentation, and then at each other, and then back at her, and agreed. They broke for the documentation to be retrieved. In the interval, one of them, a man named Garrett, older with the weather-worn face of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, leaned forward and said to her without preamble, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll be straight with you. We've heard about you from 3 different sources. The Crawford attorney, Mrs. Pemberton, and Hargrove." "I know Hargrove was pleased," she said. "I wasn't sure about the others." All 3 said the same thing. He looked at her directly. "They said you were the most competent person they had worked with on these matters." All 3 specified that they meant among all people, not only women. He paused. "I wanted you to know that before we go any further." Clara looked at him. She thought about 8 years of being the most competent person in the room without anyone specifying it. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "It should mean more than something," Garrett said. "It should mean we stop wasting each other's time and talk terms." She felt Alexander beside her, very still. Not from tension. From the particular stillness of a man who is watching something he knew would happen actually happen, and is quietly glad about it. They talked terms. The terms were good. She negotiated 2 of them upward because the initial offer was fair but not quite accurate to the scope of what they were asking, and the men looked at her when she did it not with irritation, but with something that recalibrated slightly upward in their estimation of her. She signed before she left. In the carriage afterward, Alexander said, "You negotiated your own fee upward." "They started low," she said. "They didn't start particularly low." "Low enough." He looked at her. She looked back at him. He laughed. It was a real laugh. She had discovered that Alexander laughed genuinely, and with some frequency, once you got past the formal exterior, and she had come to find it one of the most pleasant sounds in her daily life. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I am watching you, and I am very glad." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. 3 months later, Alexander asked her to marry him. Not as a rescue, not in the language of protection or provision or any of the frameworks that marriage typically came packaged in Virginia in 1819. He asked her on a Sunday evening in the front parlor, without ceremony or staging, in the same direct manner in which he said everything that actually mattered. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because you need someone to marry, not because it would be practical, though it would be. Because you are the person I most want to be beside, and I would like that to be the permanent arrangement." Clara looked at him. She thought about the last time she had been in this position. Not this position. Nothing like this position. But the last time someone had asked her to commit herself. She had been 24 years old, and she had believed she knew what she was choosing. She had not known enough. She knew considerably more now. She knew what it looked like when a man saw you, and what it looked like when he didn't. She knew the difference between being useful to someone and being wanted by them. She knew what it felt like to build your own life and what it felt like to build someone else's. And she knew with the clarity of a woman who had done both which one she intended to continue doing. She knew Alexander Caldwell, not the version she had assembled from social occasions and professional contact. The real one. The man who said what he meant, who didn't manage her, who sat in the study late into the evenings working alongside her without needing to be the one in the foreground. The man who had stood in a ballroom full of people and said something true because it needed saying and not because it benefited him. The man who had offered her a house and called it practical and meant it when he said it wasn't charity. The man who had taken her hand in a carriage and said we have time and meant that too. She knew who he was. I have a condition, she said. He waited. The consultation practice continues, she said. Under my name, with full autonomy over the engagements I accept and the terms I set. Marriage does not change the professional arrangement. Of course, he said, without hesitation, as though it had not occurred to him that it would. And I keep the Richmond house, she said. It becomes ours, obviously, but I keep it because I chose it and I made it mine, and that matters to me. It's already yours, he said. It was always yours. She looked at him. Is there a third condition? He asked. She thought about it. No, she said. 2 is sufficient. Then, is that a yes? Yes, she said. That is a yes. He leaned forward and took both her hands the way he had taken one hand in the carriage, simply without theater, the gesture of a man who knows what he has and treats it accordingly. Good, he said. She looked at their hands. You keep saying that, she said. It keeps being the right word, he said. They married in December in a ceremony that was small by Virginia's standards and exactly the right size by Clara's. Margaret Hale attended. She had become, over the preceding months, one of Clara's genuine friends, the kind that form between women who have both paid close attention to what a life can look like when it is or is not lived honestly. Thomas attended wearing his best coat and the expression of a man who had been present for the worst moment of a story and was therefore particularly glad to be present for this one. Helen Pemberton was there, and the Crawford family's attorney, and Garrett from the Land Consortium, who shook Alexander's hand with the firm grip of a man who approved of the arrangement for reasons he did not need to state. The ceremony was an exchange of plain words and plain promises. Clara had written her own. She had not told Alexander she was going to do that. When she said them in the church in front of the small gathered company, she watched his face do the thing it did when something reached him past the composed exterior, a slight, genuine movement, almost too small to see, that meant everything. She said, I choose you. Not from gratitude, not from need, not from any deficit in my own life that requires filling. I choose you because you are the person I most want beside me, and because choosing freely with full knowledge and full intention is the only kind of choice that means something. She paused. I come to this with my own name, my own work, and my own judgment. I bring those alongside yours, not beneath yours. That is the arrangement I am making. Alexander's response when the minister indicated it was his turn was shorter. Everything she said, he said, and I will spend however long we have trying to be worthy of the choice she just made. The minister looked slightly uncertain about whether these constituted proper vows. Margaret Hale leaned to the woman beside her and said quietly but audibly, They're proper. In the years that followed, the consultation practice grew. Not explosively, Clara was not interested in explosion, which was a young ambition and not particularly sustainable. She grew it carefully, choosing engagements that were worthy of her attention and declining the ones that weren't, a distinction she became better at with every year. She hired an associate in 1821, a woman from Fredericksburg, 24 years old, with the kind of natural aptitude for accounts that Clara recognized because she had always had it herself and had spent too many years not knowing it was a professional asset. She mentored her. Directly, specifically, with the kind of frank conversation about competence and compensation and the particular challenges of doing serious work, while being taken less than seriously, that she wished someone had had with her 10 years earlier. The woman's name was Ruth, and within 3 years she had her own clients and her own card and her own negotiated terms, and when she thanked Clara for what she'd been given, Clara told her the same thing she had told herself. Sitting in that library at Whitmore Estate, on the night everything ended, You had it already. You just needed someone to confirm you were allowed to use it. Alexander's practice grew alongside hers, not in competition, but in the way of two things rooted near each other that grow in complementary directions without crowding one another. He became over the years one of Richmond's most respected attorneys, not for the reasons men typically became respected through the accumulation of powerful clients and impressive associations, but for the more durable reason of being consistently reliably right. He was also, Clara observed on a regular basis, entirely impossible when he thought he was correct about something. She told him this regularly. He agreed regularly and then continued being impossible, which she had come to accept as the tax on the other things. On the second anniversary of the ballroom night, the night that had destroyed the life she had been living and given her the material to build the one she actually wanted, Clara sat in the front parlor of what was now their house and held her mother's ring in her palm. She had not sold it. She had not worn it since that night. It sat in a small box on her dressing table, and she took it out occasionally, not from grief, but from the need to hold something that connected her to before. Alexander came in and saw her with it. He sat down beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. He knew what she was thinking. He had learned over 2 years of paying attention to read the quality of her silences accurately. He just sat beside her. After a while, she said, "I keep thinking about who I would have been if it hadn't happened." "Competent," he said. "Contained. Managing things that were not yours to manage." "Yes," she said. "That. Do you wish it hadn't happened?" She thought about that for a real moment, not a rhetorical one. She thought about the ballroom, and the ring, and the portfolio, and the carriage ride to Richmond with 2 trunks. She thought about Helen Pemberton's face when a creditor situation resolved. She thought about Ruth across the city with her own clients and her own card. She thought about Alexander in the study with the lamp on. "No," she said. She set the ring down on the table between them. "No," she said again. "I don't wish it hadn't happened." Alexander looked at the ring. Then he looked at her. "Good," he said. She turned and looked at him. This man, her husband. The one who had stood in a ballroom full of people and said something true, and had been saying true things ever since. And she felt clearly, and without ambiguity, the particular fullness of a life lived in the right direction. "You have to stop saying that," she said. "When it stops being the right word," he said, "I'll find another one." She took his hand. Outside, Richmond went about its business, indifferent and alive, the ordinary world of a city that had no idea what the woman in the front parlor of the house on the quiet street had been through to arrive here. It didn't need to know. She knew. She had built this life with her own hands, her own name, her own choice, freely made, fully meant, held open-eyed, and it was in every way that counted entirely hers.